All right, welcome to Excel Class Hub. I'm still Mr. Shola by name, aka Mr. Shu. I'll be taking another subject here, and that is CRS. Of course, this is one of the, let me use the word, interesting subjects, so to say, when it comes to religious knowledge. Now, we are looking at the topic discipleship. And I'm going to take this topic in line with peculiarity to the gospel account. Now, before I go further, who is a disciple? Biblically, who is a disciple? Contemporarily, who is a disciple? Now, a disciple simply means a learner. A learner. Somebody who learns from a superior. During the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ in Palestine, there were a group of people that Jesus tagged as his disciples, those whom we can rightly say learned under his tutelage. And then the gospel made us understand that these disciples were called at different locations and at specific times. Even though as a Bible student, you may not have this deep understanding. Now, a disciple learns from a superior. What does disciples learn? Of course, that depends on the kind of superior that they are following. You know, in followership, you are bound to learn something from your leader. So Jesus in Palestine in those days had people that learned from him. And most of what they learned from him come easily through parables, because in the Jewish tradition, a teacher usually conveys his messages with parabolic meanings or parabolic interpretation. And that's why teachers in the Jewish tradition are usually called rabbi, as a master, a leader of disciples. So they are called rabbi. Now, in line with this particular topic, like I've said, a disciple is a learner from a superior, just to put it in a simple understanding. And then in the gospel, that's in the synoptic gospel, we call it synoptic. Why? Because the word synoptic means similar account. And what are the synoptic gospel? We have the book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are the synoptic gospels. Now, we are looking at this topic in line with peculiarity, the peculiar account of how Jesus called each of the disciples in the gospel. Now, according to Matthew, that is Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 to 22, Jesus called his disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. Of course, don't forget that most of the disciples of Jesus were fishermen, but not all of them were fishermen. Some were secular workers, like people like Judas Iscariot, he wasn't a fisherman. People like James, the son of Alphaeus, wasn't a fisherman. People like Bartholomew was not a fisherman. People like Thaddeus, that is Nathanael, was not a fisherman. So we have disciples that were not fishermen, but they were disciples of Jesus. So that will call for a question of how many disciples of Jesus were actually fishermen. We shall get to that point. So according to Matthew, Jesus called his disciples as he was walking beside the Sea of Galilee. That's when he called his disciples. According to Mark, similar account occurred that he called the disciples when he was walking beside the Sea of Galilee. But according to Luke, there was a pause. What happened? We are told that Jesus came with a crowd to a sea What was the name of the sea here in the Gospel of Luke? That sea looks probably different from what you have been mentioning from the previous account. They call it Lake Gennesaret. Lake Gennesaret. So Jesus had a crowd that pressed upon him when he came beside the Lake Gennesaret. Now, from this account, are we going to say that there were mistakes from the other gospel? No. What happened was that the writer did not mention the name of the sea in the account of Matthew and Mark, but the name of the sea was mentioned in Luke. That's why they say the actual place where it took place was Lake Gennesaret. And according to Luke chapter 5, verse 1 to 11, said, when the crowd came upon Jesus and there was a press, meaning that Jesus was not having where to stand as a result of the crowd, he went to one of the sheep of the the fishermen, who later became a disciple anyway, and then he begged that they should push the boat a little into the water so as for him to stand on it and preach to the crowd. And that happens to be the boat of Peter. And then he stood and then preached. According to Luke, we were told that after the preaching of Jesus Christ to the crowd, he now went to Peter and said, now, take your net, go and throw into the water, and be ready to catch a large quantity of fishes. And then Peter began to tell him his experience as a professional fisherman that, I have been trying to get this thing throughout the night, because the best time to catch fishes is in the night. Words of professional fishermen. And then Peter said, well, because of the way you have preached, the way I was listening to you, your words contained words of faith and encouragement. So I will obey. And then Peter went and then let down his net and then caught a large number of fishes, to the extent that as he was pulling the net of fishes to the shore with the help of all his colleagues, it was breaking. And then not until other people came, and then they were able to come to the seashore. And now, what are we saying here? It was in this account, according to Luke, that disciples submitted to the leadership of Jesus. But if you look at the account of Matthew and Mark, it was like Jesus used a control over them. So in Matthew and Mark's account, they said, as Jesus was passing by the Sea of Galilee, he now told them, follow me. And they left their net and followed him. Of course, that will look magical, because somebody cannot come and meet me now as a tutor where probably I'm sitting or doing something else. And the person will now say, hey, you, come here, follow me. And I will not question that kind of commandment. It won't be easy. But here, the writers of this account did not go into details of how the disciples were actually called and how they left all that they were doing before to become a full disciple. So Matthew and Mark only summarize the call to discipleship. It was Luke that went into details of how the disciples of Jesus were called and how. It was as a result of the miracle of the draught of fishes that made every one of them to submit to the leadership of Jesus. Now, coming back to the peculiar account in the Synoptic Gospel, like I've told you, the word synoptic means an account that is viewed together, that is similar in history. So if you look at this account in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have similarities and they have almost the same account. And now we'll come to the book of Matthew, where Jesus called the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. Now, according to Matthew, the first 4 disciples that Jesus called were, all right, the first disciple he called was Simon. Now, we use the word Simon Peter. And now, let me tell you, class, Peter was not the name of this man. His actual name was Simon. His surname, the surname of this man was Jonas. The word Peter was a nickname given to him by Jesus. So as CRS student, you must take note of this, that Simon Jonas was the actual name of Simon Peter. It wasn't Simon Peter. It was never Peter by name. The Father did not give him the name Peter. It was Jesus that gave him Peter. And the word Peter, from the Greek translation, Petros, means what? Rock. So which means Jesus had a vision for this man from the beginning, that he is going to be a foundational structure on what he wants to build upon. So of course, later on, Peter became the head of the church. So the meaning of the nickname, Peter. So the first disciple that Jesus called was Simon, who was surnamed Peter. And the full name was what? Simon Jonas. And then the second disciple he called, according to Matthew, was Andrew. Andrew was his brother. Of course, we should not forget that they were both professional fishermen. And one thing about these people is that they were not educated, but they were very good at their job. And then the third person that Jesus called, beside the Sea of Galilee, according to Matthew, was James Zebedee. That's the surname of the father. And then the fourth person was John Zebedee. Of course, the Bible used the word James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So these were the first four disciples that Jesus called beside the Sea of Galilee. As he was walking beside the sea, he saw them washing their net, which means they have done that job of trying to catch fishes, and then they were not able to get anything throughout that night. So in the morning, as Jesus was walking by, he saw them mending their net, that is, washing it and about to go and keep it somewhere for another time. And then Jesus began to tell them, follow me, according to Matthew and according to Mark. Now, according to Mark, now we're told in the same story that Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee. But at a time, in Mark chapter 2, verse 13 to 17, we were told that Jesus climbed a mountain and he began to choose those that will be his disciples. He climbed the mountain and began to pick his disciples one after the other in the middle of a large crowd. Look at that account. And then in Luke, we were told that it was after preaching that the disciples left their professions and became his followers. Now, there is no contradiction. Don't forget that Matthew only summarized the story. Mark summarized the story and later told us how Jesus selected his disciples. Luke gave us a full detail of the story that Mark could have mentioned, that he could have mentioned as Mark mentioned it, but Luke was very correct to have given us the full details of the story of how Jesus called the disciples, not with magical means, like Matthew said. He told them, follow me, and they just followed. No questioning, no. That was a summary of the story. The same thing with Mark, follow me, and they just followed. But Luke said, no, there was an incident that led to the followership of Jesus Christ by the disciples. Now, Mark now went back to tell us that, look, it was not only after Jesus had already, it was not only when they had already left their profession, there was a time that they all gathered together and Jesus began to select them one by one. Now, Mark chapter 2 verse 13 gave us a full list of the disciples. And of course, as Christians, you should know the 12 disciples offhand. Gave us a full list of the 12 disciples. And if I want to ask, if I'm opportune, I will have known that this class, the most popular disciples that we all know could be Simon, commonly called Peter, Andrew, his brother, James, and John. And some of us will also like to mention Philip. Of course, Philip was a disciple. And then what happened to the rest? Like I said, the disciples of Jesus was not only a composition of fishermen, it was a composition of both fishermen, revolutionaries, accountants, public servants, and so on and so forth. So the mentality and the belief that Jesus only had fishermen as disciples was very wrong. So if that was to be a UTME question as students, some of us who might be over religious may miss out. All right. Now, in Mark chapter 2, verse 13 to 17, what are the lists that Mark gave to be the full disciples of Jesus Christ? The first 4 disciples that we are called, we found them in Matthew. Then we have a repetition of that in Mark. Then we have another pause in Mark. In Mark chapter 2, verse 13 to 17, he now gave us the full list of those disciples. So, according to Mark chapter 2, 13 to 17, we have Simon as the first disciple. Simon Peter. I told you Peter was never his name. His parents did not give him the word Peter. It was Jesus that named Simon Peter. And then we have second one, we have Andrew. Andrew is brother. The third one we have James. And then with the fourth one we have John. And now they were known as the sons of Zebedee. Sons of Zebedee. Now, Jesus also gave these ones a nickname according to Mark. Jesus gave them a nickname. And what was the nickname? They were called Boanerges. The word Boanerges means what? Sons of thunder. Sons of what? Thunder. Meaning that James and John were very temperamental. They were quick to anger. Jesus saw the weakness in them. But in his opinion, your anger will work well for me. By the time you engage in my work, you will angrily go and preach the gospel. And that's why Jesus brought these 2 people into his ministry, James and John. He gave them the surname Boanerges. The word Boanerges in the Greek word means sons of thunder. Jesus gave them the name, according to Mark chapter 2, 13 to 17. Then we now come to Matthew. Matthew was mentioned not as a fisherman, but as a what? As a public servant. As a matter of fact, he was in the civil service of those days. He was a tax collector. So Matthew was educated. He was not a fisherman. And then we now have the other one we call Bartholomew. He was a disciple. He looks like a silent disciple, but he was among the 12. Then we now have another one we call Thomas. Now, Thomas was a twin. That's why he was called Thomas Didymus. The word Didymus means what? Didymus means what? Twin. But his twin brother was not mentioned. That's the Greek word for this Didymus. Twin. Thomas the twin. That was the man who doubted Jesus' resurrection. We are coming to that. And then we have another one, James, the son of Alphaeus. We have 2 James here. Son of Alphaeus. He also looked like a silent disciple, but he was among the 12. Now, between this James and this James, who became the head of the church in Jerusalem? And that's a very good question that we should be asking ourselves. Now, there are 2 James here. James, the son of Zebedee, and then John, the son of Zebedee. Are you getting it? And then they were given the surname Boanerges. And they will now have another James, the son of Alphaeus. Out of these 2 James, who later became the leader of the church in Jerusalem, according to Acts chapter 15, from verse 1, there was a James that led the church in Jerusalem. Who was that James? That was James that was later beheaded. That was later beheaded by Herod Agrippa I. That James was later beheaded by Herod Agrippa I. And that was James, the son of Zebedee. James, the son of Zebedee. That was the James that was later beheaded. Then we have Simon, a member of the Zealot. Now, he was called Simon the Canaanian. He was a resident of Canaan, the Canaanian. Although a member of where? A member of the Zealots. And now we have about 6 religious groups in Israel during the earthly ministry of Christ. There are 6 religious groups in Israel. One of them is the Zealots. We have the Pharisees, we have the Sadducees, we have the Herodians, we have the Essenes, we have the Zealots, and we have the Scribes. And these were a set of religious groups. So this Simon was converted from this group. And this group was established to fight for the independence of Israel from the hand of the Roman government of those days. Of course, don't forget that Simon was a member of this particular cause, that enough is enough. During this period, the Romans were colonizing Israel. So Israel was under the control of the Romans. And then the Zealot happens to be a group that felt at a time they would liberate Israel from that particular colonialism. But unfortunately, it could not work. So we have talked about Simon Peter. There are 2 Simon here now. We have Simon that was surnamed Peter. We have Simon the Canaanian, who was a member of the Zealots. And then we have Thaddeus, who was called Nathanael in the book of John. Also a very silent disciple, but part of the course of discipleship. So Simon, Andrew, James, Matthew, Bartholomew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Canaanian, and then we have Thaddeus, also known as Nathanael in the book of John. Of course, John was not part of the synoptic gospel because most of the writings of John. All right, so number 10, we have Thaddeus, also known as Nathanael in the book of John. And then we have Judas Iscariot, who was also an accountant by profession. And then we have Philip. Now, Philip was also a social worker. He wasn't a fisherman. So the only fishermen among these 12 disciples were 4. Only 4 of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. Only 4. Only 4. The rest had their different professions. So starting from Matthew, happened to be a public servant. Bartholomew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simeon the Canaanian, that's a member of the Zealot, Thaddeus, Judas Iscariot, and Philip. So 8 of the disciples of Jesus Christ were never fishermen. So you must understand that, and that is one of the logics that is being used in setting your questions. So if you are given a list of options, and then options are mixed with Simon the Canaanian, Bartholomew, Simon, and John, to pick 2 disciples, or how many of these disciples were fishermen? That in that option, many of us that are over religious may even pick all, because some of us may not know that only 4 of Jesus's disciples were fishermen. The remaining 8 were never fishermen. They had their professions outside fishing. All right. So the first 4 disciples of Jesus, or the first 4 disciples that Jesus called, according to Matthew, were Simon, that is Simon Peter. I told you, Peter was never his name. Jesus was the one that gave him a nickname. The word Peter is a nickname. That's another word for surname in the Bible. In the Bible context, it was a surname, but a nickname, Peter. And then Andrew, James, and John. These were the first 4 disciples that Jesus called, according to Matthew. The 5th disciple that Jesus called, according to Matthew, was Matthew himself, also known as Levi or Levi. The Hebrew name is Levi. The Greek name is Matthew. He was a tax collector. He was the 5th disciple that Jesus called. All right. Now, according to Luke, the first 3 disciples that Jesus called, according to Luke, the first 3 disciples that Jesus called were Simon, Andrew, and James. These were the first 3 disciples that Jesus called according to Luke. So, in a way that questions will be asked in your UTME, I always like to emphasize on peculiar accounts of the synoptic gospel. You know, an account is peculiar to Matthew that may not be peculiar to Luke. Now, let me make it clear. Look at the way Jesus called the disciples in Matthew, and look at the way he called the disciples in Luke. So in these 2 cases, there is peculiarity. So which means they were not called in the same manner, but they were called. The writer introduced his own story in a way that it looked different from the way Matthew introduced his own story. But they are still talking about the same thing. So when it comes to question, and they now ask you, according to Matthew, the first four disciples that Jesus called were dash. You should know the answer is already here. According to Luke, the first 3 disciples that Jesus called were dash. You should have known that the answer is here already. So these are the knowledge that is being used, or these are the kind of test that is being used to test your knowledge in advanced subjects or in advanced programs like UTME and the rest. All right. Now we look at the next line. Now, in the next line, we have the demands of discipleship. Now, Jesus was talking about what it takes to be his disciple. And according to the synoptic account of both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to be a disciple of Jesus, you have to be sacrificial. That's what Jesus said. So the first thing is that it will cost you your life. And why does it cost your life? You have to forsake 1 or 2 things to be a disciple of Jesus. According to the synoptic gospel, you have to forsake 1 or 2 things to be a disciple of Jesus. Then the second thing is that you have to count the costs. This one has to do with readiness. Are you ready? According to Luke, Jesus said, who is that man that will want to build a house and will not sit down first to look at the cost of the building? That's it. And then, according to Luke again, he said, who is the man that is going to war with somebody that has 200 soldiers, as an example, and you are going to fight with 50 soldiers? Are you going to win? So you have to consider the fact that the discipleship, beg your pardon, demands that 1, you forsake all, 2, readiness. That's the cost. He said, Jesus told the disciples, he said, no man will be a disciple of his by touching the plow and you are still looking back. That is, you are already embarking on the journey of being a disciple and you are still considering certain things behind. A man came to Jesus, according to Matthew, and said, before I become a disciple, let me go and bury my parents. Jesus said, leave the dead to bury their dead. I don't think many students understand that language. Now, that man was not saying somebody had already died that he wants to go and bury. What that man was saying was that, let me go and wait till my mother dies, my father dies, and every other thing, I'll put them in place. Then I will now come and be your disciple. That was what that young man was trying to tell Jesus. And Jesus said, leave the dead to bury their dead. Jesus was not saying that if your parents die as a disciple, you must not go and bury them. What he was saying is that you have to consider him first. Consider the kingdom of God first. Not somebody who is alive that has not died. So discipleship in this context, like I said earlier on, who is a disciple? A learner. from a superior. And then, like I've shown you, the peculiar account of how Jesus called his disciples in the Synoptic Gospel. And then the first 4 disciples that was called in both Matthew and Mark. And then the first 3 that was called in Luke. And then we'll talk about the demands of discipleship. Of course, we will never stop learning, because in this context, we will still look at some past questions that relates to our topic. Some past questions that relates to our topic. And now, we are looking at UTME 2014. UTME 2014, there is a question here. It said, what was the primary requirement Jesus gave to those who wanted to be his disciples? The primary requirement that Jesus gave to those who wanted to be his disciples. Option A, pay tithe regularly. No. B, preach in the synagogues. No. C, deny themselves, take up their cross and follow him. I will have a pause over there. And then D, offer sacrifices at the temple. Of course, the answer is what? The answer is deny themselves, take up their cross and follow him. These are the demands and requirements Jesus was telling those who wanted to be his disciples. UTME 2015. UTME 2015, that's number 2 now. UTME 2015. According to Luke's gospel, Jesus chose how many disciples? According to Luke's gospel, Jesus chose how many disciples? Now, don't mix it with what I said earlier, that the first 3 disciples that Jesus called, according to Luke, is not a mix-up to this question. It's the totality, according to Luke. Now, A is 10, B is 12, C is 70, D is 40. The answer is B, 12 disciples. So Luke decided to summarize the total disciples that were called. He was not peculiar about the first 3 that was called in this question. Now let's look at question 3, UTME 2016. UTME 2016. When Jesus called Simon Peter and Andrew, they were dash. What were they doing then? A, they were praying in the temple. B, fishing by the sea. C, collecting taxes. D, preaching in towns. The answer, of course, is very clear. The answer is B, fishing by the sea. They were professional fishermen. We go to question 4, UTME 2017. Which disciples doubted Jesus' resurrection until he saw him? Of course, this was mentioned earlier on. The disciples that doubted Jesus' resurrection until they saw him. So we have A, Peter, B, James, C, Thomas, and then D, John. The answer is here, Thomas. That's C. The answer is Thomas. And then question 5, UTME 2018. UTME 2018. Jesus instructed his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations in the dash. In what? In the what? A, Sermon on the Mount? Of course, no. B, Beatitudes? Of course, no. C, the Great Commission? I will pause over there. Then D, Lord's Prayer. The answer is the Great Commission. The Great Commission. That's why I said they should go and make disciples of all nations. All right. Question 6. UTME 2019. UTME 2019. Which of the following was not among the original 12 disciples? Who was not among the original 12? All right. So we have A, Bartholomew. Of course, Bartholomew was here among the 12 disciples. Yes. B, Judas Iscariot. And C, Matthew. And then D, Paul. Of course, the answer is D. Paul was not among the original 12 disciples. He was a latter disciple, if not the last that Jesus called, according to Acts chapter 10 from verse 1. All right, question 7. UTME 2020. Let's look at UTME 20 and look at this question. Now, the cost of discipleship as taught by Jesus includes dash. Option A, public recognition. Option B, self-denial and carrying one's cross. Then option C, regular synagogue attendance. Then option D, working miracles. Of course, the answer is very clear here. B is the answer, self-denial and carrying one's cross. Self-denial and carrying one's cross. So, in summary, we are all aware, and I'm very sure that you'll have a better understanding of what we mean by discipleship. Like I've always said in our classes, except class hub, never stop learning.